Hello, this is episode number 2 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, a martial arts journalist. I tell stories about martial arts, and now I'm doing it here with this podcast. We're going to have a guest on in a few minutes, Chuck Mindenhall, who's one of the very best writers covering the sport of mixed martial arts, and we're going to discuss this past weekend's UFC 298 show, as well as what's coming up in the world of mixed martial arts. But first, a couple of items I wanted to get to. There was a story posted recently on the website Bloody Elbow, which, besides having the coolest name of any martial arts website out there, is one of my favorite martial arts sites on the web. They do primarily MMA coverage, but also a little bit of other martial arts, some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and even a little bit on traditional arts. I have no affiliation with them. I'm not even sure I know anyone who writes for them. I just generally like their stuff and think they do some good, solid journalism on martial arts there, as well as some just plain amusing articles. But the story I saw, I think it was an excerpt from someone's upcoming book. It dealt with mixed martial arts as the ultimate form of unarmed self-defense, and also asked the question of whether MMA should be considered a true martial art. And I'm generally in agreement with most of what the author had to say, though I don't know if you're thinking in terms of self-defense that you'd want a purely unarmed martial art to begin with. For serious self-defense in the real world, you probably want to arm yourself to the teeth. But I will say, for anyone looking to develop all-around physical self-defense skills, some form of MMA, and by that I mean some type of full-contact striking training like boxing or kickboxing, combined with some kind of live grappling training, whether that's judo, wrestling, BJJ, what have you, that should probably be your first stop. That can give you an effective foundation for any other physical skills you employ, which I think was the author's main point. But MMA is by no means the only ingredient you'd need for any kind of truly effective, well-rounded self-defense system. My one problem with the story, though, was the argument for MMA as a martial art, because that's truly a pointless argument to begin with, since no one can actually agree on what a martial art is. Really, the term martial art has lost all meaning because everyone has their own individual definition of it. To some people, a true martial art has to come from Asia, which is patently absurd since the very term martial arts was coined by Western writers who were talking about Western fighting methods like fencing. And yes, Asian countries have somewhat equivalent terms like Japanese bujitsu, which I think translates as something like war technique or war method. Budo is basically the way of war. So those are kind of the same as saying a martial art. But each of those terms have connotations that make it a bit more specific, and that's where you run into problems. To some people, a martial art has to include a spiritual element, like a lot of karate and kung fu styles claim to have. To other people, since the term martial implies warfare, a martial art has to be based in military combat techniques, which would pretty much exclude karate or kung fu or anything that wasn't based primarily in the use of a weapon. I reposted an old article I wrote on this whole topic on my website for anyone who wants to delve more deeply into it. They can find a link to my site in the show notes down below. But basically, I argue since the term martial art has lost its meaning, we should just speak in terms of combative methods. And that would include sports like MMA and boxing, more spiritual styles like Aikido, armed methods of combat, including long-range methods like firearms. We can agree these are all combative methods, though you might argue some are more or less effective than others. I think that makes for a much more simple and clear discussion on this topic than arguing about what a martial art is. Another news item which came up over this past weekend was that the UFC is going to induct Vanderlei Silva into their Hall of Fame. I have mixed feelings on this. If you look at his career as a whole, he absolutely has Hall of Fame credentials. If you overlook the lifetime ban he once got in relation to his taking performance-enhancing drugs, which maybe you shouldn't overlook. But if you're banning all the fighters who took PEDs at some point in their career from the UFC Hall of Fame, you're going to have a pretty small Hall of Fame. And Silva did have a terrific overall career as a fighter. But most of his time in the UFC came toward the end of that career, and he was honestly not that great while he was part of the UFC. So if we're basing this just on his body of work with the UFC, and this is the UFC Hall of Fame, he doesn't deserve to be there. Now, I know the UFC bought the Pride promotion where Silva had his biggest wins, and so I think they're counting that like it's part of his overall UFC career, and that's fine. Except, if you're going to count Pride wins toward the UFC Hall of Fame, then where is Fedor Emelianenko? Fedor's career in Pride unquestionably merits UFC Hall of Fame induction if Vanderlei Silva's career does. But this really comes down to the fact that the UFC Hall of Fame is just a PR tool for the company and has no legitimacy at all. Donald Cerrone is in the UFC Hall of Fame, even though he was nowhere near a Hall of Fame caliber fighter. Meanwhile, Frank Shamrock, who has always been on the outs with the UFC ever since Dana White and the Fertitta brothers took over the company, looks to be basically blackballed from their Hall of Fame, despite the fact he had one of the most impressive runs they ever saw when he fought there. He tore through everyone the way Ronda Rousey did years later. But they don't like him, so he doesn't exist when it comes to their Hall of Fame. Silva, meanwhile, goes in as part of their Pioneer Wing, which also doesn't make a lot of sense. If you want a legitimate Pioneer Wing for a Mixed Martial Arts Hall of Fame, it should probably be made up of people who had some form of professional mixed-style fights prior to UFC 1. That would be for people like Rickson Gracie and Ivan Gomez, who were stars in the early Vale Tudo scene in Brazil, as well as someone like Judo Jean LaBelle, who fought a famous mixed-style fight against the boxer Milo Savage in the early 1960s. And then there's Rickson Gracie, who should absolutely be in any Pioneer Wing for any Mixed Martial Arts Hall of Fame. People forget now, and younger fans may not even know, just how good Rickson Gracie was back then. And granted, it was a different era with far fewer fighters, and no one was really cross-training in different styles, so he didn't have much competition. But Rickson was still phenomenal for that era. Even though Royce Gracie fought in the first few UFCs and got all the recognition for winning 3 of the first 4 tournaments, pretty much everyone on Earth familiar with the Gracie family back then recognized Rickson as the best grappler in the family, bar none, and quite possibly at that time the best submission grappler on Earth, period. And I can attest to that because I had the privilege of rolling with Rickson on a couple of occasions back in the mid-90s when he was still competing in MMA over in Japan, and he just possessed inhuman skills on the ground. As a journalist covering this stuff, I've had the opportunity to be on the mats with a lot of world-class grapplers over the years, and they were all great, all a million times better than I ever was. But there were 2 or 3 who really stood out at the time. One was the guy I just mentioned, the late great Jean LaBelle, who was a good friend, and I first got the chance to work with him when he was in his early 60s, before health problems started to really slow him down. And even at that age, he was just unreal on the mats. And another guy that stood out was a Japanese wrestler named Yoshiaki Fujiwara, who was the trainer for all the early shoot wrestlers, shoot fighters you saw in Japan in the 1980s and early 90s. And when you felt his technique, it was also incredible. And then there was Rickson, who could literally sub you with one hand, who could tell you what hold he was going to submit you with before you rolled with him, and then would get you in that hold no matter what you did to avoid it. And what people like Gene and Rickson had in common was the sheer effortlessness of what they did. They were totally relaxed on the mat, almost languid. In martial arts, we always talk about technique over strength. Well, they could really actualize that because when they would put holds on you, you didn't feel any exertion from them at all. It was just pure leverage. And no matter where you moved, their feel and their timing was so impeccable that they would already be there ahead of you, locking in the next hold before you even realized what was going on. So yeah, if you're having any kind of pioneer's wing for any mixed martial arts Hall of Fame, Gene LeBell and Rickson Gracie should be at the top of your list for induction. And if there's ever going to be a real mixed martial arts Hall of Fame, membership overall should not be decided on by the UFC or any self-interested promoter. And it should include all the great fighters like Fedor and Frank Shamrock. Otherwise, why bother? But maybe our guest now can give us the answers to those sort of imponderable questions. Chuck Mindenhall has written for ESPN, for The Athletic. He currently writes for his own website, The Myth, as well as the website The Ringer, where he also co-hosts the podcast, The Ringer MMA Show. Chuck, are you there?
You got me, Mark?
There he is.
I was saying, sorry about that. Somehow it switched to mute on my end. I don't know how that worked, but I was saying I sound so much more important the way you put it. I appreciate that intro. Thank you, brother.
Anytime. For those unfamiliar, Chuck is really one of the most respected journalists in MMA. He's been nominated for the MMA Writer of the Year award, what, 3, 4 times now?
At least 3. I think there might be a 4th, but I know I've only attended a couple of them. It's kind of an exercise in futility because I know I'm not going to actually win it, but
Always
I think
deserving.
It might be 4. Yes, I'm not sure.
Always deserving of winning, but unfortunately, Ariel Helwani has that award locked up because I think he pays people to vote for him. And Chuck privately wishes Ariel would get hit by a bus so someone else can win it. Isn't that true, Chuck?
No, come on, man. That's my guy. We talk all the time. Like he's my co-host over there at the Ringer MMA show. And to be honest, though, and to be fair, he should be taken out of that consideration because if anything, name it after him. Okay, he's won it 14 times in a row. Name the award, the Ariel Helwani Award or something, and then give it to somebody else. Because otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels here.
Yeah, we're just kidding about that. We love you, Ariel. At least I do. Chuck really wishes you get hit by a bus, though. And anyway,
this is the subliminal show we got going on here. I like it already.
How do you do it? Tell a little about yourself. You're originally from Colorado, and what you first got interested in MMA because they held UFC 1 right down the street from you in Denver. Is that it?
That's such a Copperfieldian way to start, isn't it? Like just say, "Hey, jump in and tell us about your life." I did. I grew up in Denver, and yeah, I was there. I was there all through my school, like high school, and I went to college out there. But I've moved around all over the place since. So it's now I've spent far more time away from Denver than I have in Denver. But I still consider myself a Coloradan.
And you were a journalist back then, or were you on the path to being a journalist at that time?
I wrote for my local paper, the Metropolitan, which was in downtown Denver. There's a college that I went to called Metropolitan State, and I wrote for that paper.
You started out writing about music, right?
A lot of music stuff, some art, like general arts that would come through town, things like that. I think there were I remember interviewing their baseball coach and doing a profile on him and the team, the Roadrunners, which was a very good D3 basketball team. And I think I did a piece on that as well. They ended up winning some like national titles, or at least being in the national title game. But not really. I mean, I would say I probably wrote a dozen articles back then for them, but it was just kind of dipping your toe into something to see if you like it. And And apparently I liked it because
A-
years later I stuck to it. You know what I mean?
And you started covering mixed martial arts pretty early in the sport's history, back when it was almost an underground thing that only reprobates like us paid attention to, right?
Well, it's funny because you're one of those guys who like really has like knowledge of deep roots into martial arts all over the field. And I think when I met you, geez, what was it? Maybe in 2010.
Long time ago.
Yeah, a long time ago. I remember because it was still forbidden in New York, and I remember we went to a
Yeah,
show, and we did some other stuff like that. But uh, I would say that it's kind of it's strange because you're kind of tethered, just like a lot of us, to like the movies, the movies that came out that preceded MMA and all that stuff. And so you
hmm
kind of there was this, just like everybody else, I shared in this like, man, what would happen if this guy fought this guy? You
Yeah,
did a lot of that stuff. I think it was just active in my imagination the whole way. I was always a boxing, fan. I
right.
especially liked as I got into college, high school, college, and then beyond. Um, Really good boxing writers, the ones who chronicled the sport so well that were basically. I mean, these are people who are giants who could write really well, and they're covering boxing. And I thought they're not like slumming it to cover combat sports. And as MMA started to kind of pick up, I was working at a paper in Los Angeles or in the Inland Empire outside of Los Angeles, and there were a couple of fighters there. Dan Henderson, not far away was Rampage Jackson. There were a bunch of others kind of scattered around that area,
Mhm.
and it was right before it was when Dan Henderson was going to fight Rampage. So it was kind of like in my backyard, the two guys who were in my geography there, like we're getting ready to fight. So I'm like, I should do a piece on this. Um, and so I did. And then as that kind of took off, and then Dan Henderson then had a fight with Anderson Silva. And I was like, I'm going to do a bigger piece, like a profile, and I'm going to go to Columbus where it was UFC 82, I believe it was, and do this big piece. So I did, and it just kind of went from there. It was a very strange thing. Like I didn't mean to really get into covering MMA, but as I did those pieces, and at the time, Thomas Gerbasi, I had a conversation with him. He's the editor over at
Right.
UFC.com. And I'm still working at I'm editing a paper, like an alternative weekly. So it wasn't any conflict for me to be like, hey, do you need help? And he was like, he saw the piece on Dan Henderson. He was like, yeah, let's, would you mind doing a little profile on this guy or this guy? And so I kind of was just dipping my toe in for like maybe 6 months. And then it just so happened that I think I did this. What was it? There was a magazine that was going to start called Rage that was like out of a big New York publishing house, the same one that do Slam for the NBA Slam
hmm
magazine. And I
Yeah.
was like, oh, this is, and they were like, so the editor was in place. There was another editor that they had already kind of they set up, and they they kind of hit me up and they said, would you want to do our first cover story? And I was like, sure. So they sent me out to Minneapolis, or like I guess it was Alexandria, Minnesota. So I had to go into Minneapolis, drive out there to interview Brock Lesnar. I did this big piece, and they never got off the ground. So it's like one of those things. It's that same old story in MMA. I ended up selling it to Fight Magazine, and then Fight started to use me for a lot of their cover stories, and that's how it happened. It
I
just
You did the
that's
same
how it
thing
took
to
off.
me at Fight.
Yeah,
You hired me when you were there to do
yeah.
something, and they folded before you
That's
could
how it worked
publish
back
that.
then,
Yeah,
Mark. That's how it
yeah.
worked back then. It was more like a tumbleweed, writing career in that sense of the sport was just taking off, and I think there was big interest from people with money on the periphery figuring out how to get in. And the writing at the time, there was really nothing.
Did you ever envision it getting this big? I never did. Honestly, I thought it was just going to disappear when they were having trouble even getting it on pay-per-view years back.
So you're kind of preceding like my career in writing about it. But so if you go back to those days, yes, I 100%. I never thought it would do anything. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
I remember early BJ Penn, stuff like that. Like, and just I mean, that was after the unified rules and sanctioning in certain
right.
areas and stuff like that. I don't think I knew about it marginally in the late 90s. I don't know how much you paid attention to it, but during that very dark period where it was just like basically a persistent taboo that was just
Yeah.
on the fringe, I didn't really pay too close of
It's
attention.
like child porn or
It
something.
was.
That's
It actually had sort of such an underground,
yeah. Yeah,
dark
yeah.
feel like before there was a dark, but it's like it had that feel. And I was like, I remember it's funny, man. And I kick myself for this all the time. In Denver in 1993, this is the first UFC event. There was something called, and you might remember, like I know that you like I said, you have these tentacles that go back to all these different things. But do you remember something called? I think it was like sabaki.
Yeah, yeah, it was a basically that was like a Kyokushin karate
Yeah.
type tournament.
Okay.
Full contact, kicking, punching to the body, but only kicking to the head, no punching to the head.
Yeah. So okay. All right. So they used to run in Denver. This is a couple years prior to the UFC, first ever
Hmm.
UFC.
Yeah,
These very late at night when George Michael's Sports Machine was on, I'd
yeah.
be watching TV and stuff, and then they would do these commercials only very late at night. So it was like 1 a.m. They'd run these commercials. Sabaki's coming
I
to Denver.
They
And I
put a
was
couple of those on, I think the might have been the MSG channel here in New York.
that's
They
funny, man.
televised it. And Pat Smith, who won that, he was in the first UFC.
That's right. Okay. Okay. So I knew that you would have the history on this
Yeah,
more than me. It's almost like a dream now to remember this. But
yeah,
so I'm in my room and I would watch that and I was like, you would just see that I never actually saw an event. I just saw the commercial and it seemed so violent and crazy to me that I was like, whoa. And so every time I'd come on, I'm just super focused on what it's doing. And so there was like a context even before UFC one, right? That I was like, this is real fighting. Like this is crazy. This isn't like a points tournament or something like
yeah.
that. This is something completely different. Couple years later, they're advertising UFC. I remember seeing some stuff, at least in the paper, about UFC one. And it's funny, I always correlate this because I believe it happened on November 12th, 1993. A couple weeks earlier than that, a little less than a couple weeks earlier, River Phoenix had died. And I remember seeing this. There was something in the Bronco. I was at a Denver Broncos game and they showed the River Phoenix thing. And I always correlate this because that same day, I remember seeing something about UFC one and actually being like, I should go to that. You know what I mean? I would like to go to that. And I ended up not. I just kind of forgot about it. And then it happened. And obviously, a decade goes by where it kind of persists. It's basically a taboo. And then it starts to take off. And it's just one of those things now in the strangest of ways when I'm writing about it and all that stuff. I think, damn it, man, there I was. I was right in the backyard at Mick Nichols Arena's right down the street. I could have been there for UFC one and I didn't go.
Did you watch it on TV?
No, I didn't even watch it at the
Uh,
time. But
well,
it wasn't that easy back then. I mean, it was a pay-per-view,
yeah,
right?
it
So
was a pay-per-view. I
I
watched
mean,
it
I
with a
was
couple of friends, and we were
yeah,
wondering how legit was it going to be. I knew a lot
right.
of the people fighting in it, but you didn't know how legit it was going to be. And then that first fight, you see Gerard Gordeau kick
Yep.
the sumo wrestler's tooth, and it goes flying into the first row. And you said, "Yeah, I guess this is pretty real."
Yeah. And it was great because I mean, I've revisited it now, and this is
Mhm.
one of those reasons because I've done these like you mentioned Gerard. I remember I did an interview with him. He's kind of a dick, actually. He was kind of not a nice dude, but but he was kind of, I mean, all those guys were kind of like that. There's just these early, pioneers of what for the UFC at least. And yeah, it had such a strange feel, man. It had such a strange feel, and I
It
think
did.
that it's funny that some of them were like, the one dude wearing what's his name, the boxer who wore the one
Oh,
glove,
Art
and
Jimerson.
yes,
Yeah,
exactly,
I
man.
talked to Art, and he when I interviewed him, he told me his manager was out watching the first fight and came back into the locker room in tears and told him, "You can't do this." And he said, "I have a contract. I have to fight." And
Yeah,
Art, he goes, "No, please don't do this, Art."
that's funny, man. That is funny. It's a crazy thing because it seems like in the context of MMA, it feels like forever ago, right? Like that this all went down. But if you
Yeah,
put it into any other context, like I just said, River Phoenix was still around right before that. Like you
yeah.
could put it into context of other stuff that was happening, and it doesn't feel that long ago. But it's just
Uh,
a stranger thing.
Yeah. Now, I was talking on an earlier segment before you came on about Vanderlei Silva was just inducted
Oh,
into the UFC Hall of Fame's Pioneer Wing.
yeah.
What did you think of that?
I mean, the Hall of Fame thing is such a strange, strange entity, and obviously,
My impression is it's basically just a publicity tool for the UFC and has no
yeah.
real legitimacy.
I think so. And honestly, even Vonderlei getting in because I know at one point there was beef between Dana and Vonderlei as well. maybe some of these beefs I feel like he finally either forgets about over time or they
Not
bury
the
the hat.
Frank Shamrock one.
Not the Frank Shamrock one. And you want, and again, if you want legitimacy and objectivity and to earn that a little bit, right? A little semblance of that. I think that that's the one, right? You got to see him get in there before you really believe that they're letting everybody who
You
merits.
can't have a sports hall of fame that is decided on by one
No,
person or one group. Other sports hall of fames are voted on by the people who cover the sport for a living, like you.
right.
I used to be a member of the Boxing Writers Association, and we would vote for the Boxing Hall of Fame every year. Not
Yep.
that my picks ever made it in, but there is no mixed martial arts journalists organization. Well, why is that?
You're not going to get Butterbean in there, man. I know that you keep lobbying for this, but the fight is what I like. What was your question? Why isn't there an
Well, why
association?
don't we have an MMA journalists association like they have a boxing or baseball writers association?
Well, they started one. Um, and to be completely honest, and this it sounds terrible, but they started one maybe, man, what was it? Maybe 8 years ago, something like that. And a lot of the people that you would know were involved. The first year I was involved, you'd pay your dues, all that stuff. I know, and it might still be going, to be honest. And I feel bad because I've not been an active journalist per se over the last like few years, so I'm
Mhm.
not like not as roped into that world. But I know that guys like Josh Gross, Ben Folks, I know Ariel was a part of this, Mark Ramondi, a lot of the people who are covering the sport were all involved in this. And to be honest with you, man, I just didn't feel like it was doing anything at the time. Like it just didn't feel like it had like a bigger meaning. Maybe, maybe I'm complicit in this because I'm not doing anything myself towards
Yeah,
it.
you
But
gotta get in there and organize it a little better. Become. I'll vote
I
for you
don't
for president,
I
Chuck.
don't know if that's quite my my character or personality, but I mean these types of things. I mean, you're right. Going back to your original point, only thing that would really matter is if there's a media driven Hall of Fame, right? Because
Yeah.
that's how it has to work. I'm 100% with you. The UFC's Hall of Fame is obviously just the UFC. It's not like they're taking they're looking at somebody who, unless they own the rights, like they got Pride, they got Pride, they've got Strikeforce and others, but unless they, they're not going to induct Ben Askren's Bellator run, or something
Yeah.
like that, or
Yeah.
they're not going to do that. So
Yeah.
it's not quite it's just like you said, it's a tool. It's a tool for them.
Yeah. So let's turn to more recent events. This past weekend's big UFC 298 card, which was an interesting show. Ilya Taporia defeated Alexander Volkanovski to take the featherweight title, and you called it. I give you credit. You picked Taporia in what I guess was a small
Yeah.
upset. He was a small underdog going in. Well, what did you think of the show?
The whole card was it was pretty good, right? I mean, I
Mhm.
thought that you got it was funny because there were enough what would you say, like these guys, the new era of kind of fighter that were like
Mhm.
on this card. So it felt a little bit like that thing that's been going on for the last year or two, but maybe more concentrated, that sea change of guys coming up. And Taporia, definitely one of them, one
Yeah.
of these younger dudes who's got it all, carrying a ton of power. And I think it was crazy with a guy like him because he kind of like, he met the escalation of the spotlight head on. Like he was like, all right,
Yeah.
here we go. This is my moment. I'm going to make it shine. I think he really handled himself well, but he was virtually unsung before that. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
I was like you. I was leaning toward Taporia a little bit just because it felt like one of those crossroad fights where one
Yes.
guy was on the way up and the other guy was maybe just starting to descend a bit. Is that how you felt about
The
it?
UFC has a tendency to like, guys who are contract guys, guys who are like legacy guys or guys on the downturn or guys about to leave, where they kind of, send him to the glue factory, put him up against some guy who like is a young stud who's going to go in there and they know is just going to blow the doors
Yeah.
on. They did this to Frankie Edgar. They've done it to, there are other examples, and it's always a sad thing because you're like, why couldn't they just give this guy like a legacy fight, like something like some equivalent to where he's at on the way? Why'd they have to feed him to this
Yeah, they
young?
got to build up the next generation at the
Yeah,
expense of the old.
but it's kind of interesting because I didn't quite feel like that was what was happening with Volk, but it certainly played out that way. It played out like Volkanovski, and I think there was a little bit of a red flag attached to him going into this one because he just got knocked out, a couple months earlier by Islam Makhachev, and there, I think there was just some red flags in general. Like he's 35. There's this weird stat going around that like guys who in the lower weight class
Yeah,
from
I
welterweight
had
down.
heard you say that on your
Yeah,
podcast, like
yeah,
1 in 22 or
yeah,
something
and
against younger
and
fighters.
so it stacked up in a weird way. I know that everybody was sort of like, yeah, but I can't go against Volkanovski, and I felt that too. Like this seems absurd. I mean, he's beat some of the greatest featherweights there are, and he beat him going away. It
Yeah.
wasn't close. But I just couldn't shake it, man. I kept thinking about it, and it actually what I was seeing was exactly what happened. That he'd get hit, crumble, and go down, and that's exactly what
I
happened.
I felt like the big factor in this whole situation with Volkanovski the last few months is his ego. Yeah, he took the fight rematching Makhachev in October on what, 5 minutes notice they gave him. It was ridiculous because he couldn't win a clear-cut decision over Makhachev in their first fight when he had a
Right,
full training camp. Did he think he was going to do better the second time around with absolutely no training camp?
right. There was
And
a little delusion in play. I think the fact that he was coming on late in that first fight probably gave him the confidence to be like, you know what, man, I know what I'm doing now. But without a full training camp and all, it just in retrospect, it's going to be the decision that
right.
ended his run. And I'm
And
like,
then not just taking that fight, but then after taking a fairly brutal knockout in that fight, he turns around and fights a really good young fighter like Taporia four
yeah,
months later.
the
Uh,
exact wrong guy. You don't
yeah,
want to go against that guy. And that was always the feeling. I was like, that's who he's good. That's not a rebound fight, man.
yeah, yeah. I don't
That's
know who, if anyone, he has around him giving career advice, but he needed someone to step in and tell him, don't take the Makhachev rematch on short notice. And he really needed someone to tell him, take 6 months
yeah.
off to recover from that knockout before fighting Taporia.
You hear his faction, his corner guys basically saying like they didn't like that he took that Islam fight. They tried to, maybe talk some common sense, but there was a big payday attached. I think there was some delusion attached, and now it enters into that career defining crossroads, like you mentioned, that feels like it could be a spiral. I don't want that for him, man, because he's been so good. And he's such a good guy. You know what I mean? Like he's
Yeah.
one of those guys in the sport that's very level headed,
Hmm.
very funny, just kind of down to earth. I don't want to see him kind of spiral out of control
Right.
like a Hidden Barrow or something like that, where you're like,
Yeah.
oh no, what happened to that guy?
Well, in boxing, it used to be the managers, trainers made all the decisions, and fighters just showed up and fought whoever,
Yeah,
whenever they were told, which was obviously not the best setup for the fighter because they would get cheated or didn't have control of their career. But I'm not sure fighters are much better off when all the decisions are in their hands because good fighters think they can beat anybody, and they will do this kind of stupid
yeah,
stuff of taking fights they shouldn't take and then getting knocked out for it.
yeah. I agree, and I think that there's a certain and it's a fighter. I mean, there's a certain kind of invincibility that you feel, and I know that like he just been knocked out, but he was still invincible essentially in the featherweight division, and all these
Yeah.
other guys have been gunning for him, right? And I think
Hmm.
that there's this feeling at some point that you're like, you're not as good as me, young buck. That sort of feeling,
Yeah.
like you're not going to beat me, and that sort of whatever it is that just kind of nestles inside of your psyche. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing he just, whatever it is, but that it never looked like a great matchup. I would have, first of all, you would have liked to have seen him have more time in general from that
Yeah.
first knockout, but to go against that guy, man, it just it spelled doom. But
Yeah.
hopefully it's not the end for Volk. I hope he like, he's good enough. Like if he doesn't get chinny, if he doesn't get chinny and he doesn't start to fade that way, like he's good enough, he's a hard trainer enough, like all that stuff, that I think that he could actually still do some things in MMA, even if it's not for a title. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I
I
still
think he
do
can
some stuff.
still be around for a while, but what's the point if you're not the champion, you're not winning the championship. He's made money. I don't see him doing that well after two back-to-back brutal knockouts like that. Yeah, I mean, guys can last like Andrei Arlovsky took some knockouts and then hung around for a while, but was never
Yeah.
really championship material again. And
Yeah, you
I
wonder. I do feel like this next one to be like that'll be the true examination. That's the whole subtext, right? Like,
yeah.
is he now? no longer at all, Volkanovski. That's going to be the thing. The only trouble with him, and he kind of mentioned this with the Islam fight, he wasn't handling his idle time, well. And I think that part of why he jumped back in there was because he was depressed in a weird way. He wanted to, get out of the spotlight. He didn't have something to focus on. And those guys, man, you always
Get a
worry a little.
hobby.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Because you wonder, you worry, I guess, a little bit about can Volk walk away from the game, and we're prematurely talking about this,
Yeah.
but can he walk away from the game when he needs to, and feel okay with it? That's going to be his question down the road.
Yeah. The other thing that stood out to me was Volkanovski kept eating those calf kicks early in the fight without being able to defend them. But
Yeah,
he's someone who's known for delivering good
I
calf
know.
kicks. How do you learn how to throw a technique and never learn how to defend it?
I don't know. I don't know if he like was caught. You're right. I don't know if he was caught off guard by that or if he just, sometimes you slow down. And if that's the sign too, that's not a good one, right? Like if your reaction times and all that stuff start to slow, you don't want to be in the fight game too long.
yeah, yeah. But hey, Taporia was
Yeah,
very good, deserved the win. What do you see in the future for him?
man. It's kind of one of those. I hate this Conor McGregor. I hate that it's almost like the Muhammad Ali reference, like, well, this is like Muhammad Ali, these guys who learn how to use the microphone. And you're like, well, there's very few people that are actually like Muhammad Ali, and Conor McGregor's kind of in that same boat where he was just this meteor that arrived
Yeah,
and
I
was,
I
you
agree
know,
completely. I
yeah,
like Taporia. I think he's excellent, but
yeah,
slightly overrated. I've heard
right,
the McGregor comparisons, and I think he's definitely more well-rounded than McGregor ever
sure.
was. But I'm not sure I see that raw level of talent that McGregor had when he was younger. Do you?
Talent wise, yeah, that's a tough, that, I think that still kind of remains to be seen. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I don't know. Like I was mostly like in reference. I guess if I'm going to make a Conor McGregor comparison, it would be that Conor busted through in a way that was like for Ireland, right? Like we had guys like Marcus Davis, who was like the Irish angler, but he's not Irish.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
not from
Yeah.
Ireland. It's like we have these
Yeah.
guys who are just Ireland
Yeah.
is kind of a fighting.
Yeah.
We've
Spain
got
has
the
never been a
yeah
hotbed of fighters, I don't think.
yeah, unless you're fighting bulls or like running away
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
bulls. But in the sense that Ireland got behind him and it was sort of infectious for the rest of the world. I'm wondering how it works, with Spain. I think they're going to try to do a show in Spain,
Yeah.
and if they do it
They
at
do
that,
have very good karate and
yeah,
taekwondo guys over there, by the way. I
yeah,
don't know how well that translates to MMA viewership.
it'd be interesting. Let's put it that way. I think that it won't be the. I don't think it's going to be sweeping America like McGregor did, but I do think that he represents a country that has not been represented in MMA like this yet,
Hmm.
and that will feel huge. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think in terms of the new idea of what a star is, he will fill that out. Like more so maybe than a guy like Sean O'Malley or these guys who kind of have these star like that kind of it factor a little bit, but it
Yeah.
doesn't translate as big as Ronda Rousey or something like that. But it's um but they're kind of the UFC stars of the day. I think he'll be up in that top 5 or something as this year goes on.
Right. Speaking of McGregor, and it wouldn't be an MMA podcast without discussing Conor McGregor. Uh, Now, someone, I can't remember who, had predicted Conor would have not one but two fights this year. Who made that prediction, Chuck?
I believe it was you who made that prediction, Mark,
No,
was it?
I'm thinking it was somebody named Chuck Mindenhall. Are
All
you
right,
still
yeah, yeah.
feeling good about that?
No, I'm not feeling good about
No.
that. I'm wondering if he'll ever fight again at this point. Like it's just one of those things, man.
What is going on with him? They've been talking about him fighting Michael Chandler forever, but he keeps putting it off. Do you think we will see him fight again?
Now, talking to Ariel, who I think always has like an ear to the ground on these things, and he's always
Mhm.
talking to people within camps, and more so than me, he still thinks that Connor's original statement that he'll fight at the end of June will stand. He still thinks that that happens.
Mm.
I don't know, man. At
Do
this
you,
point, I really don't know.
do you get
It's
any
such
sense
a
he's just trying to wait Chandler out at this point, that for some reason maybe he doesn't like the matchup against a wrestler and he's waiting for Chandler to finally get tired of this and sign some to
I don't
fight
know.
someone else? Then, as he does the day after he does that, you'll see McGregor come out and say, "Well, I'm ready to fight. Here's the date. Get me Nate Diaz."
it could be more so from the UFC side of things, only in the sense that he has 2 fights on his contract, and you know how they like to get guys tied up before their last fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a feeling it runs deeper into the business side of things.
Yeah.
Like it's going into that side. And if you even listen to Dana right now, like he's got money, money is harder to deal with. When you got money, it's like, and he's kind of pointing these things out. Well, I've seen that kind of gamesmanship before from
Yeah.
Dana and all this. I believe that's really where the holdup is. I
Mm,
also think that, and this was another thing that we talked about on the Ringer MMA show, like Dana wants to announce it. I think he wants it to be the big deal when he announces it and all that
right.
stuff. And I think that Connor probably jumped the gun by,
Did,
by saying that. I think that I think that he wants to fight Chandler. I really do, man, because he's fared well. Remember Chad Mendez and some of these guys, these
yeah. Yeah.
stockier, shorter guys. He's able to kind of end that he has a reach
Right.
advantage and all that. Like he likes to tee off on them. So I think he doesn't mind that. You
Do
know,
people still care at this point, or are we moving into a post-McGregor world? I mean, he hasn't fought in 2 years. He hasn't won a fight in 4 years, and he hasn't beaten a top flight fighter in more than 7 years. When he finally does come back, are people still going to care as much as they once did?
because he's like got this residual phenomena to him. Like it's almost like
Hmm.
because we were so blown away when he did what he did back in, now it's been years and years ago, I guess leading up all the way through the Mayweather fight, right? Like, and then beyond that,
Yeah.
it's kind of been what we're dealing in right now, which is just I guess not even that, not Mayweather. I would say the Nurmagomedov fight. But beyond that, it's kind of become this like just kind of spending time in muted
Like a
excitement.
reality show almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing. And this particular time has seemed really exhausting. Really, and I said this at the beginning, I was like, can he get through an injury like this, whatever timetable it ends up being, and be the same star he returns when he returns? And I think that because he has transcended, and it's crazy to say this, but because his name has transcended into other sectors outside of the bubble of MMA, like and even
Yeah.
sporting, where like people just know who he is. I
Right.
think he retains it for now. Like he'll still feel like a star just because everybody. And it's like if
He's a star for the sake of being a star, not
yeah, because
necessarily
everybody just
for
knows
what he
him.
can do anymore.
People who don't
Uh,
pay attention to the sport at all still know who Conor
yeah.
McGregor is. So it's like one of those things that once he comes back, it'll feel like a big event based on that. Um,
Right.
but I don't know how many of those he has left in him, man. I mean, it's just it, and it's a complicated name too, isn't it? Because so much of it has been negative headlines and
Yeah.
ugly
Uh,
incidents and things like that. So
Deservingly so.
yeah, it'll be
Yeah.
very interesting,
Yeah.
to be honest, man. It'll be very interesting to
Right.
see what the reception is.
So coming up this weekend, we have the big PFL versus Bellator card. Does that excite you, Chuck?
Who's fighting on that? I don't even
Uh,
know, man.
if that, I guess, answers the question. Main event, heavyweight, Henan Ferrer versus, not Ferrer. I'm blanking out on his name. I can't
Yeah.
even remember. Against Ryan Bader.
Oh, there's
Yeah.
your problem. You got a Ryan Bader fight. You don't want to.
Yeah.
No,
Uh,
I'm vague. I mean, I'm gonna have to tune in because I guess this was kind of the intrigue. If once PFL bought the Bellator, it was like, how will this year play out? How will they how will
it
they run both promotions? All this stuff. So I feel
It
like we get
kind
our
of
first
feels like
answers.
the NFL Pro Bowl where nobody actually wants to be there. I keep seeing fighters dropping out,
Oh
and
my lord!
you're just not seeing a lot of heat for this.
I will say there's been, and dude, we live in the MMA world, and there's been very little chatter about
Yeah,
this, and
yeah,
part of that obviously is because there was just a UFC pay-per-view, but I don't think it's gonna get like the run that PFL hoped.
yeah,
Like I don't think it's gonna get that kind of rub because I when the card came out, and I'm not trying to be mean. I mean, it was a little underwhelming. There's a couple names on there that you'd hoped were going to be, and Kayla Harrison
yeah,
not
yeah.
on there, but she like the flex over to UFC. So there's a little bit of a disappointment.
What's coming up then
Yeah.
that does excite you in the MMA world?
Well, UFC 290. I mean, I hate to always be the UFC guy, but the UFC 299, main card is pretty damn good, man.
Yeah, O'Malley versus
Yeah.
Vera.
Yeah, you got that Cheeto Vera rematch. Gilbert Burns is on that card.
Mhm.
You got Michael Venom Page coming over to fight Kevin Holland.
That's interesting because he's an
Yeah.
exciting fight. I think if
Yeah,
he
he's your kind
wins,
of
I
guy.
think they will try to build him up, give him easy fight. I don't want to say easy fights, but match
Yeah.
him well, like they did with Alex Pereira to
Yes.
build him into a champion or at least somebody who can get a title shot.
You have Saint Denis and Poirier too. That I mean, those are just again, that's kind of almost like the Topuria Volk fight, right? Like you got like an old guard
Yeah,
who's really not that old, but he's just old guard because he's been around a while against this young marauder who is just going through people. So I feel like,
right.
you know, so much of it is hype and imagination up front. Like, and I think that you get a card like that, it's fun to think about, you know. So I think that one will play out to be like
Yeah.
a pretty memorable card. How about you? What did you got your eyes on? It's probably some layaway from Burn.
I'm interested in 300 to
Yeah,
see how Kayla does, just almost like for the freak show aspect of it. Can she actually drop that much weight and still be a strong fighter? I
yeah.
mean, that's 35 pounds from where she was as an Olympian.
Well, I heard you on your first podcast, you were talking about this, and I have to say, you really pointed out what I think is the biggest issue here. Um, I'm not sure it's healthy. I mean, it's one of those things that you're just like, man, I don't know. They said that she's already done test runs. No, man, I don't think that anybody can do that kind of test run. I think it's going to come down to fight week, and I would not be surprised if it ends up being at a catch weight or something in the end, you know. Maybe
Maybe,
there's
yeah,
a provision already in the contract in
yeah,
case that happens, but I don't know. That's a huge task, man.
yeah, it is. Um, Anyway, I want to really thank you for doing this and taking the time to talk here. Where can people follow you, read you, listen to you, find out all about the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall?
Well, Mark, I'm glad you asked. No, you can I do I got my own site, themyth.com. That's
That's
MITH for man in
MITH.
the
Yep.
Yep. Yep. That's where I haven't been writing in there as frequently as I need to be, but I'm gonna be like beefing that up and running some columns in there again. I still do stuff for the Ringer. There's a couple pieces a month. I'll probably do some extended, some writing, some feature writing for UFC 300 around that. So that'll be coming up, and then the Ringer MMA shows where we do the podcast once or twice a week, depending on what's happening, but always after the pay-per-views and always a preview before the pay-per-views. So those are and you can find me on Twitter. I think it's just at Chuck Mindenhall or X or
I
whatever.
will put
Yeah,
a link to your site
there
down
you
in
go.
the show notes. Everybody should definitely go there. We got cut off a little abruptly there, but I want to thank Chuck for being on the show. I also want to thank the Black Swan, Eleanor Academia, for providing the music to tonight's show. You can find a link to her site down below as well. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode. I'm tentatively scheduled to have Kelly McCann on if we can work out the timing between us. Kelly runs an MMA gym now, but in his previous life, he was one of the co-creators of the Marine Corps martial arts program and served in an elite Tier 1 military unit where he went around the world getting a chance to use some of those skills on deserving bad guys. And hopefully he will be on to tell us all about that next time. Until then, thank you for listening and keep punching.